It's been on my, I speak at a lot of different places I have over the last 25 years or so, and it's always been my bucket list to do a Sunday morning service in a barn. So thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Hold on, check that one off my list. Got it. Okay. Oh, boy. I'm looking forward to this morning, and I appreciate you folks having me out here. I do. It's such a friendly and receiving group of people, and just beautiful country out here. The leaves are starting to turn already. It's like, wow, I know, what, some people upset about that? No, it's okay. Fall is okay. And yes, by the way, I know you said, hey, noon, ladies start getting nervous. No. I know the Lions game starts at 1, so trust me, guys. We're good, okay? I know I got to get home in time to get the Lions game up. So we're going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ this morning. And as I get into this, I mentioned this yesterday, but I'll say it again. I'm what you call a Christian apologist. An apologist doesn't mean, obviously, that I apologize for my faith. Apologist comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to give a logical, evidence-based argument for a belief system.
Yeah, you have this.
That's an impressive car. But that's what my passion is. I want to give people a logical, left brain argument for what it is that we believe. Now, I want to make sure and stress, we're not saved by logic, of course. All right? My faith is not dependent upon logic, but it is backed up by logic and by science and by history and by intellectual reasoning. And so I don't need to convince any of you in here that Jesus rose from the dead. You know that he did. We believe this by faith. But I want you to know it's a logical faith. And we interact with our friends, our family, our coworkers, our kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews. We got skeptics that are out there that we have to deal with. And how do we answer some of the questions that they may have? So that's what my passion, my primary ministry is equipping people with the answers to simply explain what we believe as Christians. Now, my style of apologetics is what I call Christian apologetics made simple. And so I try to simplify everything in easy to understand fifth grade language, if you will. And that's the way that I do that. And that's how we're going to approach the resurrection this morning. Now, before I get into this, let me just say, I want to get some of my own announcements out of the way so that I don't forget later on. Pastor mentioned the top 10 proofs table. I explained to you folks yesterday what the top 10 proofs are. Some of you that weren't here, people come up to the table and they say, well, what are these? And we have to explain it one at a time to everybody. So it's just easier for me if I take a couple of minutes and explain corporately what's over there. Those of you that were here yesterday, well, you hear it again. But those of you that weren't, I just want you to understand what they are. These are audio recordings from me, special studio recordings from me, where I've taken literally 35 years worth of research into all the things that we believe as Christians, to examine the scientific evidences behind them, the logical left brain arguments behind them, the mathematical evidences, the archaeological evidences, historical evidences, and I've recorded them in very simple, easy to understand layman terms. So, for example, this morning I'm talking on the resurrection. Well, one of the topics is top 10 proofs for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This morning I'll probably go through about maybe 10 to 15% of what's in there, okay? But it's very simple. It's like, okay, here's the topic, and then here's proof number 1, here's proof number 2, here's proof number 3. And the idea is to become a walking encyclopedia in your own family. So if somebody says to you, well, how do you explain this? I want you to be able to go, 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known how to answer that. But now, let me tell you some facts that I'll bet you didn't know. And then before you know it, we're out there putting 1 Peter 3:15 into practice, always being prepared to give an answer when someone asks for the reason for the hope that we have, but to do this with gentleness and respect, okay? So you probably see these little cards around here. On the front side are the 14 different topics, and they are things like top 10 proofs the Bible is true, top 10 proofs for God's existence. There's top 10 proofs on evolution. Telling you right now, Darwinian evolution is not true. The Earth is not 4.6 billion years old. The universe is not 13.8 billion years old. Everything really was created about 6,000 years ago. And you know something? The documented scientific evidence proves that. The evolutionists themselves have discovered the evidence for this, but it's censored from the school science books. But they admit it to each other in their own peer-reviewed publications. And I document those peer-reviewed publications you can look at yourself. Everything I give you is public information. Look it up yourself. I've just done all the research and legwork for you so you don't have to do it, okay? But just so you know, if anybody says to you, well, yeah, but haven't they dated the Earth to be 4.6 billion years old? I want you to know something. The very same potassium-argon dating that dates the Earth to be 4.6 years old, 4.6 billion years old, that very same potassium-argon dating also dates the Mount St. Helens eruption of 1980 as happening 2.8 million years ago. I'm not kidding. The very same potassium-argon dating. I document the Geochron Laboratories isotope dating on that they themselves did. And Geochron Laboratories in the 90s, when they did this, was the #1 evolutionary radiometric dating laboratory in the country. There's just so much stuff that we're not being told in the textbooks. So that's what the top 10 proofs are. Look over these topics. If you want to get them, you can get them a couple of different ways. You can get them in physical CDs, or you can get them in MP3 flash drive. If you get them in CDs, this is what the CDs look like. This is the top 10 proofs for a young Earth. Some of these topics are 4-disc sets. They're $30 a piece. Some of them are 3-disc and they're $25 a piece. Some of the topics are 2-disc and they're $20 a piece. If you got all 14 topics in the series, it's like 37 discs total. Individually, they're going to add up to $325. But if you get the entire series, we discount that $325 down to $229. Okay, and comes in a nice display case. If you want to get the top 10 proofs in MP3 flash drive, all 37 discs are in this little thing. You got to be under 30 to understand it, okay? But if you get them in this, you just plug it into your computer. They download right into your computer, and you can listen to them there, but you can also copy those files to your phones, devices, tablets, listen to them while you're out and about, give them to your friends, whatever. These are cheaper. To get them all in CDs, discounted to $229. To get them all in MP3 flash drive, it's $179. And you'll see the prices are on the back of this, but I do want you to know, and I told everybody yesterday, we actually have a sale going on right now that's not reflected on this. So everything right now is actually about 25% less. So these, for example, when you see all the CDs are $229, it's actually today, it's $169 right now to get them all in this. And instead of $179 for these, they're $129. And I will say, if you do want to get the whole shebang, which is all of them in CDs and all of them in the flash drive, kind of double sets, give one to somebody or whatever, instead of $169 plus $129, we're doing $169 plus $20. So figure $189, and you can get double complete sets. That's what we have over there afterwards. So if you want to get them, just come on over to the table, and we'll be over there, and you can get them afterward. Just please listen to them if you get them. Don't stick them in a drawer somewhere. I want you to equip yourself with the answers. Okay, so let's talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yesterday, when I talked about God's existence, one of the things that I said to you was that technically, I can't prove to you that there's a God. But in the same way, I can't prove to you George Washington was president of the United States, because none of us were there. So all I can do is present enough evidence to let you see that it is illogical to deny that he was president. Well, in the same way, I want you to see that the evidence shows it's illogical to deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He logically had to rise from the dead. Again, my faith isn't dependent upon logic, but it's backed up by logic. And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. First thing to discuss, keep in mind, when Jesus rose from the dead, okay, this was documented by eyewitnesses at the time this happened. When Jesus rose from the dead, he hung around for 40 days. He was seen by hundreds and hundreds of people at one time, 500 brethren at one time. And by the way, 500 brethren is not 500 people, because 2,000 years ago, whenever anybody wrote crowd sizes, sorry ladies, I don't know what to tell you, but women and children were not included in crowd sizes. And that includes even in scripture. So 500 brethren is actually 500 men. If somebody wrote about 100 people in a room 2,000 years ago, and there were 33 men and 33 women and 34 children, the person would write there were 33 brethren, okay? So you need to understand, for Jesus to be seen at one time by 500 brethren, you factor in women and children, Jesus was probably seen by a good 1,500 to 2,000 people. And that's just in that one time, not to mention all the other sightings of Jesus for those 40 days. So let's remember one simple thing to start. Jesus' resurrection was witnessed by many, many people and documented during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. So the people 2,000 years ago were writing down, "We saw Jesus alive." And this is documented within 15 to 20 to 25 years after the events, during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. That's very significant. Now, I have had people say to me, skeptics, and I get into debates and such, they'll say, well, Bob, come on. They're writing something down 15, 20, 25 years later. How are you going to remember those kind of details 20, 25 years later? All right. Well, let's talk about that. If you ask me what I had for dinner last Tuesday, I don't know. I really don't remember. But if you ask me about the day that I met my wife 45 years ago, I can tell you exactly where that was. It was at Elby's Family Restaurant in Columbus, Ohio. That's right. Sorry, guys. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, Buckeye country. See? Troublemaker. Don't get me in trouble. Well, you have to accept me anyway. You gonna be Christian or not? Okay, you gotta accept me here now. But I remember I was a waiter in this restaurant. I was on my lunch break, which it was a morning shift, so it was really breakfast. I was having pancakes, and I remember the cinder block walls, but they were painted light blue. And this was her first day, and I was the one who was going to be training her. And I remember flirting with her and getting nowhere, falling like a lead balloon. But why do I remember? If you ask me about the day I was married, I can tell you specifically everything that happened. If you ask me about the day that my first child, Colleen, was born, I remember the very first words I said to her when the doctor handed her to me. My first words to her were, "Hey, little girl," okay? Why do I remember those kind of details from decades ago, but I can't remember what I had for dinner last Tuesday? Do you think maybe those are important events in your life? And when important events in your life happen, they tend to get burned into your memory. Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here, all right? Do you think a guy walking across the water is the kind of thing you tend to remember? Okay, I think it is. Do you think seeing a guy 3 days after he was crucified is the kind of thing you tend to remember? I got no problem having these people from 2,000 years ago having burned into their memories the things that happened only 15, 20, 25 years ago. And that's even without the assistance of the Holy Spirit filling in any memory gaps. So it's very significant that this is all documented during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, by eyewitnesses and contemporaries of eyewitnesses that were there. Now, one of the things I shared with you yesterday when talking about the truth of Jesus versus others are the accounts of the manuscripts. And I'm not going to go into as much detail about that, but I want you to understand that if you look at what historians use to determine whether they can trust something from ancient history, ask any historian, ask any atheist historian. They'll tell you it's the amount of corroborating manuscript evidence to support something in the past. Well, to put this into perspective, the things that we read in history books that are completely accepted by historians are the accounts of Plato, for example, because there's 210 corroborating manuscripts surrounding Plato. The Gallic Wars of Julius Caesar, there's 251 manuscripts. These are the kind of things that make historians say, hey, this is trustworthy, I can accept that. Do you know that the New Testament of the Bible has over 24,000 corroborating documents and manuscripts? It is by far the number one most historically authenticated and validated course of events in ancient history. By far, 24,000. Second place is the Iliad by Homer with only 1,757. That's second place. And historians completely accept the historicity of the Iliad by Homer. So first, you need to know, logically, we have the historical documentation to back up the resurrection of Jesus. But let's go ahead and take a logical approach to this. Right? If Jesus did not rise from the dead, I want you to stop and think about this now. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, how would history have unfolded? Would history have unfolded the way that it did? Well, let's think about that logically. First of all, let's look to the disciples, okay? The disciples, even atheist historians acknowledge that it's historically documented that the disciples were tortured and killed for their faith in Jesus Christ. In other words, they died torturous deaths proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. Again, even an atheist historian will acknowledge that the disciples believed Jesus rose from the dead. Because this is why it matters. Nobody dies for something that they know is a lie. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, the disciples would know he didn't rise from the dead. And if they know he didn't rise from the dead, what would they be thinking after 4 days? 5 days. Again, just think about it logically for a second. Jesus said he was going to rise from the dead in 3 days. So, it's now 4 days, 5 days, 2 weeks, and the area is still in the tomb. Come on, you don't need a degree in human psychology to figure this out. What are the disciples going to be thinking? They're going to be thinking, well, this is embarrassing. Turns out we backed the wrong horse. Turns out Jesus wasn't who he said he was. They would not be thinking, hey, let's go ahead and claim that he rose from the dead anyway. There's no motive for this. There's no money in it. There's no book deal. There's no movie deal. They're going to be persecuted, beaten, tortured, and killed. But hey, what a great scam we can pull off. We can trick people into thinking he rose from the dead. I'm sorry, that's just not logical. And history shows that none of the disciples recanted in their beliefs that Jesus rose from the dead. So under torture and death, they stuck to their guns. Again, this is why even secular historians acknowledge, okay, they at least believed he rose from the dead. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, explain to me how his brother James ended up accepting him. Because you realize James, Jesus' half-brother, James was not a believer in Jesus. Oh, I'm sure he loved his brother. But he didn't believe he was Lord. He didn't believe he was God on earth. And in all fairness, you can't really blame him. Look, I got a brother. His name is Mike. Okay? Mike lives in Columbus, Ohio. Trust me, if Mike ever tried to claim that he was God on earth and I needed to worship him, yeah, right. Okay? So you can almost kind of see James saying to Jesus, hey, look, bro, I love you, but come on. I grew up with you, okay? I know. No, you're not. Something happened after Jesus was crucified. Something happened that caused James to worship his own brother as Lord. What happened other than the resurrection? Something caused the disciples to go from being cowardly before the crucifixion to being bold and brave to the point of their own death after the crucifixion. What is that something that happened other than Jesus actually rising from the dead? And by the way, you can't say, well, maybe the disciples were just a bunch of brave people willing to die. No, they were pretty cowardly. I mean, come on, they fled when Jesus was arrested. Peter, by the way, he denied Jesus 3 times. You might say, well, Peter's probably the most cowardly of the bunch. No, he was actually the bravest of the bunch. Who was the only disciple that was willing to get out of the boat and walk on the water with Jesus? Peter was. He was the only one willing to step out there. The rest of them weren't on the water, but Peter did. And he's the one that denied Jesus 3 times. So they were a cowardly group of people. What happened to cause the change in the disciples? Again, just left brain. Think about it logically for a moment. Because this is stuff that's documented in history, including outside the Bible history. Saul of Tarsus was the chief persecutor of Christians 2,000 years ago in Judea. Saul of Tarsus converted to become the Apostle Paul and write so much of the New Testament, okay? If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Saul of Tarsus would have been proven right, wouldn't he? He would gloat in his victory. So, you stupid Christians, it's been 3 weeks and he's still in the grave, okay? Where's your Jesus now? Something happened to cause Saul of Tarsus to become a believer in Jesus Christ and preach his resurrection to the point of his own death. Would somebody please tell me what event caused Saul of Tarsus to start worshiping Jesus Christ as a risen Lord? What event other than Jesus actually rising from the dead? Think about Luke for a minute. Luke, the historian, wrote the Gospel of Luke, then wrote the follow-up, the book of Acts, okay? Luke describes in detail the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but Luke was a physician. He was also an historian. Luke had a pretty important reputation. As a physician, he depended on people trusting his expertise. And Luke is not the kind of person to make up some crazy story like this. As a matter of fact, if you read the beginning of Luke, he lays out to this letter to Theophilus. He says that I have carefully investigated everything so that you can know with certainty the things that you have been taught. All right? So here's an historian and a physician who examines all the evidence. It's like, wow, Jesus absolutely rose from the dead. What caused Luke to be persuaded? But some people will say, and I've heard this many times, that, well, maybe the disciples just made up the resurrection story and convinced people that it was true. That's typically the main thing that the skeptics will argue. Well, let's examine that first of all. Let's pretend hypothetically that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and made up the resurrection story. Okay. History documents, secular history documents, that after Jesus was crucified, something happened to cause Christianity and the belief that Jesus rose from the dead, something happened to cause it to spread like wildfire throughout the entire Roman Empire. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, how is it that the belief that he did rise from the dead spread like crazy all throughout the Roman Empire? How do you explain that? Over the next few decades, while people are still alive, the eyewitnesses, it's spreading like wildfire. How do you explain that if he didn't actually rise from the dead? Because remember, if he did not rise from the dead, nobody saw Jesus alive with their own eyes. Nobody even knows anyone who claims they saw Jesus alive with their own eyes. So any crowd that any of the disciples is speaking in and saying, oh yes, 10 years ago, Jesus rose from the dead. Everybody in the room is going to be like, I've lived here my whole life. I remember 10 years ago when they crucified Jesus. I didn't see him alive. Anybody here see Jesus alive? No. Okay. Does anybody here know anybody who says they saw Jesus alive? Nope. Nobody. I mean, again, think about it logically for a moment. If Jesus rises from the dead, everybody that sees him, they're going to know it firsthand. But you don't think that somebody saw Jesus alive and didn't go home and tell their husband, their wife, their brothers, their sisters, their kids, their parents, okay? In other words, you have first-hand eyewitnesses of Jesus risen, and then you have, at least 10 to 15 people around that person in their circle that would be told. So therefore, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, in any gathering, you're going to have at least some people that say, hey, I saw him with my own eyes. But you're going to have a boatload of people that say, I didn't see him, but my mother swears she did, and my cousin swears he did. There's going to be enough corroboration that would explain people believing that Jesus rose from the dead, because one way or another, you can't get past this. If you remove the Bible and you just go with ancient Roman history, something happened to cause thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people to believe Jesus rose from the dead and worship him as God. So people were believing it. How do they believe it if nobody can corroborate it firsthand and nobody can even corroborate it secondhand? Because if he didn't rise from the dead, there's no corroboration anywhere. Nobody's going to believe a disciple that says something like that. Now you might say, well, did Christianity really explode in that way? Well, let me read to you a little bit. This is outside of the Bible, okay, from sources hostile to Christianity. Okay, like, for example, Pliny the Younger. Now, Pliny the Younger was the Roman governor of Bithynia. He lived from 61 AD to 112 AD. The Roman governor of Bithynia was writing about Christians, and here's what he wrote, quote, "The Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God." All right, now let's stop right here for a second. Here's the Roman governor of Bithynia who's acknowledging these Christians are singing hymns to Christ as to a God. So they're already believing that Jesus is some kind of God. If he died and stayed in the grave, he would have been proven a fraud. No, because Jesus said he was going to rise in 3 days. So when he didn't, he was proven a fraud. Nobody's going to be worshiping him as a God if he lied about being God and coming out of the grave. Pliny also went on to say, regarding the execution of Christians, he said, "I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they still persevered, I ordered them executed." Cornelius Tacitus. Cornelius Tacitus is considered the greatest historian of ancient Rome. He was Rome's #1 official historian. He lived from 55 AD to 120 AD. Cornelius Tacitus wrote about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and here's what he wrote, quote, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, or Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." And then listen to what he says next. He says, all right, we crucified him. But then he says, "And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, but now even in Rome." Here's Rome's official historian documenting in Roman history, we crucified Jesus, we had this movement stopped, and then something happened and it's broken out and it's spread. Now it's all the way even to Rome. All right? If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, what is the alternative explanation? What happened when Jesus died and is in the tomb and was proven a fraud by not coming out? What happened to cause history to unfold this way if Jesus was not seen? I'm open to suggestions, okay, because there is no logical argument for that. Flavius Josephus was a Jew 2,000 years ago. He didn't believe in Jesus as Messiah, okay? But he was also a historian for Emperor Vespasian in the Roman Empire, Flavius Josephus. And here's what Flavius Josephus, he lived from 37 AD to 97 AD. He lived during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, during the lifetimes of the disciples, okay? Here's what Flavius Josephus, the historian for Emperor Vespasian in the Roman Empire, here's what he wrote, quote, "At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Now, Josephus isn't saying that he personally believes Jesus rose from the dead. He's just, as Rome's historian, documenting they're saying Jesus rose from the dead. I have to ask, how do you have history being written this way if Jesus was proven a fraud? It's just a logical way of looking at it. But they'll still say this: disciples stole the body. I've debated these people. Well, they stole the body and they made up the resurrection account. Okay, so here's what we do. Let's take that argument. That's probably the biggest argument that they use. So let's take that argument and let's put it under some cross-examination. Let's scrutinize it. The first thing I told you already, what's their motive? They have no motive for this. They're not going to get around and go, okay, Jesus proved us wrong. Jesus is a fraud. It's been 2 weeks. He's still in the grave. Okay, let's make up this resurrection story. That's absurd. Nobody thinks that way. Okay, but let's say you're a hardened skeptic. You fold your arms and say, I don't care. I think they did that anyway. Well, okay, fine. Here's my next question for you. How did they do it? How do you pull it off? Even if you want to believe the disciples are going to say, let's do this, which is absurd. But if you insist on believing that, would you explain to me how it happens? You see, 2,000 years ago, you had Roman guards that were guarding the tomb. You have a 2,000-pound stone that's rolled over the grave opening, and there's a Roman grave seal on it, and you have 24-hour guard in ancient Rome. It's death to anyone who breaks a grave seal. It's death to anyone who overcomes a Roman guard. So you would have to believe that the disciples, who were so wimpy and scared when Jesus was alive that they scattered, so I don't know who he is, you would have to believe that they now are going to risk death by doing something that they know isn't true anyway. But still, the skeptic will say, I don't care, I think they did that. Okay, fine, let's think it through. So let's say the disciples, here they are, they're walking up there's the guard standing there, okay? They're not going to overpower a Roman guard. So here's typically what some skeptics will say. Well, maybe the guard fell asleep. All right, let's say the guard fell asleep. Number one, that's absurd. If you want to believe that the guard took 3 melatonin, whatever. But let's say he's there sleeping. If a Roman guard falls asleep on his job, he doesn't get suspended without pay for a week, okay? He gets executed. So no Roman guard's going to let himself fall asleep. But the skeptic says, well, I say he still did. Okay, fine. So let's think about the scene for a moment. There's the Roman guard sleeping. Here come the disciples. Shh, right? Be very, very quiet, okay? It's Elmer Fudd, in case you want. All right, so I get up there. Now, they break the Roman grave seal. Good, he's not woken up yet. Now they got to move that 2-ton stone. Do you have any idea how loud stone scraping against stone is? Okay, as they're sliding that stone against the stone. Take a couple of cinder blocks, put one on the other and slide it. You know that loud screeching sound? Now imagine a 2,000-pound stone scraped against the stone of the cave opening. And then they get the body out of there. What? Now they go hide the body somewhere? It's like, now let's get out there and start telling people Jesus rose from the dead. And they'll believe us. Again, if you are a skeptic and you're holding on to this belief, you're being illogical. You might as well just fold your arms and say, well, I don't believe George Washington was president. Well, maybe it was a stand-in. Maybe it's what. There comes a point when you're really being absurd. Okay? There's no way, logistically, the disciples could steal the body, hide it, and then convince thousands and thousands of people that he actually really rose from the dead when nobody can corroborate it. So then here's where the skeptic will end up going. Maybe they were just hallucinating. Yeah, they hallucinated. They thought they saw Jesus risen. Well, think that through logically for a moment. If they were hallucinating, number one, hallucinations typically only last a few seconds. They don't last for 40 days extended. Hallucinations don't have back and forth logical conversations with you as Jesus did. Hallucinations don't eat as Jesus ate fish with the disciples after he rose from the dead. And by the way, all the disciples had the same hallucination? All of them did? And the thousands of people who were mass converting and claiming that they saw Jesus alive, they all had the same hallucination? I mean, it defies logic. Not to mention the fact, even if you want to believe they were hallucinating, which is absurd, what's the first thing they're going to do? Go to the grave. Oh, nope, there's the tomb still in place. Okay, well, I guess we were just seeing things. Nobody's going to believe that. It's not going to explain the explosion of Christianity. So then here's what I'll hear. And I'm just thinking of the things that as I've debated people over the years that have tried to deny the resurrection. That it was legend or folklore that developed over time, the resurrection of Jesus. That doesn't hold up to logic or intellectual scrutiny at all. You know why? Because legend, folklore, mythology, this happens in other areas, not in the same area, and it happens generations later. The claims that Jesus rose from the dead were being documented and voiced and believed during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. Okay, mythology doesn't work that way. You don't have mythology where people are right there in real time where they're still alive and saying, this happened. I can't sell you on mythology that supposedly happened 20 years ago if it didn't really happen. I can't sell you on some fake mythology that's something that happened in Fostoria, 20 years ago, if you all know that's bogus and it didn't happen. So no legend, no mythology is going to explain that. The best you could come up with is maybe a couple hundred years later, somebody decided to make up a resurrection claim and then some folklore developed from that. But that's not what happened here. Jesus' resurrection was being preached during the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. Which then brings us to something that, honestly, I think this is one of the most ridiculous arguments I've ever heard, but I can't believe the secular historians that have been willing to believe this. It used to be referred to as the swoon theory. The belief that Jesus didn't rise from the dead because they buried him alive. He wasn't fully dead. He was comatose. They thought he was dead. And so what they did was they took Jesus off the cross thinking he's dead, and then they buried him, but he wasn't totally dead, and he came to in the grave, and he came out of the grave, and then the disciples nursed him back to health. I was watching the History Channel one night, and this was around Easter time, and you had an historian on there, a PhD historian, and he was making this argument, sounding all impressive and intellectual, okay? And he said, oh yes, and the disciples nursed him back to health, and then he went on to marry Mary Magdalene and have children, and this is the true story of Easter and whatever. So I'm watching this PhD historian. My eye is twitching. So next day I call my producer and I say, track down that historian, invite him on my show to debate me on this. And he agreed, he actually agreed. So he came on the show, we debated this. And I remember in the debate, I said to him, I want to ask you a question. You're a PhD historian. Let's pretend we crucified somebody today, not 2,000 years ago, today. Let's take a 33-year-old man, healthy, and let's do everything to him that we did, do everything they did to Jesus. So let's beat him, let's whip him, let's scourge him so he's not even recognizable. Let's put a crown of thorns over him. Let's nail him to a cross today. And then let's run a spear up through his side, so much so that everybody thinks he's dead. But he's just this side of death. He's really comatose, but he's not quite dead. Then let's take him off the cross. And instead of putting him in a tomb, now this is what I'm asking the historian. I said, instead of putting him in a tomb, let's put him in an ambulance. And let's drive him to Johns Hopkins Hospital. And let's have a team of the best surgeons in the world working on him with the latest medical advances and technology that we have in medicine to give him. What do you think the odds would be that he would be discharged from that hospital in 3 days? Let alone move a 2,000-pound stone by himself. And I remember the historian got a little bit flustered. And I kid you not, he said, well, they didn't have the kind of medical technology we have now, but I mean, they did have aloe vera plants. I'm not kidding. I said, hold on. I'm not letting him get away with that. I said, so you know that there's no way somebody today could walk out of a hospital 3 days later with our best medical technology today. But you think Jesus walked out of that grave and moved that stone because he rubbed some aloe vera plants on him? Is that honestly your argument? You're a PhD historian. Is that really your argument? And he's like, well, he's getting irritated with me. I'm like, I don't care. Okay, you go on the History Channel and you know, spread these kind of lies. But see, the problem is, when these skeptics give their arguments, on the surface, sometimes they sound good to people. You know, well, that could make sense. Well, that could be. My job is to come along and say, okay, let's examine this logically then. Okay, let's cross-examine it like we're in a court of law, and let's see whether the evidence really stands up. Anyway, sometimes skeptics will say, I won't accept anything that it says in the Bible. Okay, I talked about this yesterday. If you have somebody say that to you, well, I'm not going to trust anything that it says in the Bible because that's a religious book. Don't let them get away with that. I'm telling you right now, just because the Bible's the Word of God, and it is, it doesn't change the fact that it's still history. It's history documented by people that were there. So it is still historical evidence that we can't just ignore. But let's be super gracious to the atheist, to the skeptic. Let's pretend every single Bible on planet Earth was burned up. So there's not a single Bible anywhere. Let's pretend all the manuscripts are burned up. As a matter of fact, let's take every single Christian writing for the last 2,000 years and burn them all up. So we have nothing, no Bibles, no Christian history, nothing written by Christians in the last 2,000 years. And all we have to go by are the anti-Christian hostile sources of the Pharisees and the Roman Empire. We only have their writings to go by. What could we learn just from their writings from 2,000 years ago? Let me rattle off a few basic facts that you would learn just from reading that. For the people who say, I won't listen to anything in the Bible. Okay, fine. This isn't in the Bible. Well, I'm not even going to listen to pro-Christian sources. Nope, these are all hostile to Christianity sources from 2,000 years ago. Here's what we would learn from them. That Jesus was a real person who existed, supposedly born of a virgin, had an earthly father who was a carpenter. He was a teacher. He was a prophet. He taught repentance. He taught followers would become brothers and sisters. He changed the belief of the Jews. He claimed he was God. He claimed to be the Messiah. He had magical powers and performed miracles. He healed paralyzed people. He accurately predicted the future. He was persecuted by the Jews. He was betrayed by a friend named Judas. He was beaten with rods. He was forced to drink vinegar. He was forced to wear a crown of thorns. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The sky grew dark during his crucifixion. There was an earthquake during his crucifixion. He was buried in a tomb. The tomb was found to be empty. He reportedly appeared to people resurrected. He reportedly showed his disciples his wounds. His disciples say he ascended to heaven. One of his disciples was named Matthew. The disciples were persecuted and martyred for their faith. None of the disciples recanted. They switched from gathering on Saturdays to Sundays. Jesus was worshiped as a god with hymns being sung to him. Okay, that's one of the things I read to you earlier from Pliny the Younger. After his crucifixion, something happened to cause Christianity to explode and the worshiping of Jesus to spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. None of that comes from the Bible. None of that even comes from Christian sources. All hostile to Christianity sources from 2,000 years ago. All right, I will leave you with this, because we do have a Lions game to watch today. Okay, I'll leave you with this. Would the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus stand up in a court of law? All right, well, who better to ask than, well, I'll tell you what, let's do this. How many of you, show of hands, how many of you know the name Lionel LeCoux? Anybody know the name Lionel LeCoux? Not you, you don't count. Okay, okay, all right. A little bit, very few people. Okay, I'll try this one then. How many of you know the name Perry Mason? Okay. All the old people. Well, I see some young people here doing this. Okay, well, all right. Lionel LeCoux was basically the real-life Perry Mason. Okay, Lionel LeCoux went in the Guinness Book of World Records. He was placed in there in January of 1990 as the #1 most successful trial attorney ever. He won his 245th consecutive murder acquittal. He never lost a case. Even Perry Mason, they wrote a token loss in there for him. This guy, Lionel LeCoux, never lost a case ever. He knows what evidence is going to stand up in a court of law. Now, between us, I hope all those people really were innocent, okay? But Lionel LeCoux decided to take some time and research the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus because he was curious if the resurrection of Jesus Christ would stand up in a court of law. You want to hear his final verdict? I'll tell you what he said after all of his research, searching outside the Bible, ancient Roman history, and everything else. Here's what Lionel LeCoux said verbatim, quote, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by belief that leaves absolutely no room for doubt," end quote. I just want you to know, okay, look, we believe by faith that Jesus rose from the dead, but it is a logical faith. It's backed up by logic, by facts, by history. This actually really happened 2,000 years ago. It really did. And if Jesus rose from the dead, then that means he's who he claimed to be. And he claimed to be Lord. He claimed to be the only means of salvation. You do not get to the Father except by him. He made this clear, okay? So I'm thinking we trust him. So equip yourself with the answers, with the evidence. Be bold. Talk with your kids, your grandkids, nieces, nephews, friends and neighbors, all right? Share the faith with them. If you want to get some top 10 proofs, come over and get those, okay? Give them to if you don't know how to answer something, say, here, listen to this then, okay? But whatever, just listen to them. Let's equip ourselves. And I know it's not going to be long before Jesus returns, but in the meantime, let's try to get as many people saved as we can. I think that we should do that. Anyway, I so much appreciate you folks having me out. I really do. And Pastor Bob, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thanks so much.